Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Steelers Breakdown podcast. First one on me going solo. John, obviously, and I kicked it off yesterday. Really good episode. We talked about a bunch of things. We talked about Brandon Aiyuk, Russell Wilson, Justin Fields, Arthur Smith, how Patrick Queen's can help the defense. We covered a bunch of topics. We introduced ourselves. I really hope you guys enjoy it. Let me know kind of what you guys thought of that. He'll be joining me every Tuesday, John will, and we'll have a great show. But today, and moving forward on Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, and Mondays, it'll just be me and you guys. Maybe every now and then we'll have a guest on. And, that they will help pepper in some color for us. But for right now, just me. And today I do want to circle back to one of those topics we talked about yesterday. I do want to talk about Mr. Brandon Aiyuk. I know that we have talked about him the entire offseason, and it has really kind of dragged along, right? I mean, ever since Deontay Johnson really got traded, you heard the Brandon Ayuk whispers right away. And so this is something that is not new. This is something that I think has been covered from a lot of angles, but let me try and give you guys as many angles as I can today. I wrote a column earlier today about why I think this is a really complicated situation, much more complicated than most other receivers they would trade for. Cortland Sutton's a very simple trade ask, but this one is a little different. You're talking about a guy under a fifth year option that can feasibly stay in San Francisco for 2 more years because San Francisco is going to control that tag. And Ayuk's good enough to where I think they will tag. They're going to be able to shed some big contracts this year after this year, and this feels like one more tune-up with the band. Like that's what it feels like to me. This is the last year. One of those receivers is gone next year. They drafted Ricky Pearsall for a reason. Now they even drafted Jacob Cowing, if you want to throw that in there. So someone's gone. They signed Jawan Jennings long term. Deebo Samuel's under contract long term. Brandon Aiyuk is the one that is not under contract long term. I posted this on Twitter and I said, listen, I think the option could be to trade Deebo Samuel and sign Brandon Aiyuk to a big deal after this year. I just don't know if they have the flexibility yet, and if they do, they might want to have that rollover cap, to next year because they're going to be up against the cap. Brock Purdy's going to get a new massive extension very soon. Christian McCaffrey already got his. Nick Bosa got his last year, so they are really piling up big time contracts, and they're going to have to shed some of these big contracts soon enough. But Brandon Ayuk is a guy that makes that offense go. And, this is why I don't really subscribe to the idea personally that he's a kind of a creation of Kyle Shanahan's scheme or the 49ers offense. That's easy to say when, you have all that talent around you and McCaffrey, Kittle, Debo, all these guys that you point to and you say, okay, maybe they are making him more than, his own merits are sticking out. But you watch the tape, he's a complete kind of receiver. I mean, he's a guy that runs routes really well, could separate against man or zone. He's really their best man beater. So when you talk about their issues against man coverage, Brandon Ayuk's the one guy that really wins there. At least at the first and second levels, I think when he gets those deep routes, it can become a little murkier. But I really think first and second level route runner, he's really good. He's got great snap on his routes, got great pacing. So I really like Brandon Ayuk from that perspective. He's a great blocker, so he's willing. He's one of those top guys that just gets after it in the run game. And you have to in a Shanahan offense. He would fit, Arthur Smith's philosophy in that respect beautifully. They would be perfect in terms of the philosophy in the run game to get. He can block his behind off. He's got great yak ability because he's, this twitchy, fast, quick guy that has really good short area quickness. And so you can really make guys miss on screens and do other things like that. And I think the difference between him and Debo and the reason why I think the 49ers might want to trade Debo is Debo's a unique player. You don't see Debo's around. Every guy that gets compared to this guy, that gets compared to Debo Samuel as the next Debo Samuel, the running back build, they aren't like he's a guy that is built like a running back, but has elite contact balance and yak skills while still being a great route runner and being able to win on the outside and inside. It's not easy to find those guys. The issue is he's been hurt a lot, and his play style is very physical. You don't find guys that are as physical as Debo Samuel after the catch. And so his long-term kind of projection in the NFL, I think it comes into question when you have a guy that gets banged up like that because he's such a physical player that he just gets so much toll on his body from playing day after day. And that's really where it is when you look at Debo Samuel. So I think the Ayuk, trade from the 49ers perspective is where's the leverage? I think Brandon Aiyuk is pushing the limits of the leverage he has. I think, the trade request was a natural kind of stop for this. I expect him to hold out training camp if they can't meet, obviously his demands before training camp starts next week for the 49ers. The vets report next week for them. I don't expect him to show up there. And is he really willing to miss games? I mean, listen, Chris Jones was last year, and he was able to get his deal reworked and came back. And obviously that kind of forced the Chiefs' hand, but we've seen guys in the past sit out a year, and some of them, you know, Le'Veon Bell, obviously the big one, but Deshaun Watson sat out an entire season too, and they haven't come back and been the same guy. That year off from football really does take a lot out of you, when you're not playing like that. And so it's a risk, especially in a contract year, if you're a guy like Brandon Ayuk, to not play. And so there's risks involved in that. And I really don't think, it's $14 million that he'd have guaranteed on that 5th year option. I mean, that he's in a tough spot. He's in a tough spot just because the leverage game definitely, I think, favors San Francisco here. And again, they don't just control him this year. I don't think they're going to let him hit free agency next year. I think the franchise tag's very likely. But in the event this gets really ugly and the 49ers are willing to move him, which again, I don't think they actually are right now. I think that that's an earnest, declaration they're putting out there. They're not trading him. Teams have called about him. The Steelers have called about him. They're not willing to move him. And it makes sense. What would the cost be for the Steelers? Probably their first round pick. I've seen guys throw around the second round pick or in the fourth or second, and next year's three, something like that. I think they would want that one this year. And I'm not opposed to trading a first round pick for Brandon Aiyuk, but it has to be specific to what you think your first round pick's going to be. If you think your first round pick's going to be a late first, I think it becomes a lot more enticing. I want to read to you guys just the list of first round wide receivers since 2020. It's some pretty impressive lists. If you go to 2020, it's Henry Ruggs, Jerry Jeudy, CeeDee Lamb, Jalen Reagor, Justin Jefferson, and then Aiyuk himself. 21, it's Jamar Chase, Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith, Kadarius Toney, Rashad Bateman. 22, it's Drake London, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Jameson Williams, Jahan Dotson, and Traylon Burks. 2023, it is Jackson Smith-Njigba, Quentin Johnston, Zay Flowers, Jordan Addison, and then this year you can have Malik Neighbors, Marvin Harrison Jr., Rome Odunze, Brian Thomas Jr., Xavier Worthy, Ricky Pearsall, and Xavier Legette. So there's a few trends I took away from that. First of all, if you're picking a wide receiver early, I mean, the hit rate on those guys is incredible. Ruggs is the one obvious miss, and obviously that was due to off-field things. Jeudy, I think, is probably not worth the draft slot he had. He's a solid player, but is he really worth where he went? Lamb's an obvious hit. Rager's an obvious miss, but then Jefferson and Aiyuk are obvious hits as well. And then you go to the next year, Chase, Waddle, and Smith, all guys drafted very early in the top half of the first round. Obvious hits. Toney, a miss. Bateman, a miss right now, kind of a meh player right now. Guy that, thinks had a lot of potential, but it's dealt with a lot of injuries. Then you go to the next year, London, Wilson, Olave, those are all hits. Williams has had a really rocky career, but the talent's there. And then guys like Traylon Burks obviously are not are busts. And then you look at Quentin Johnston, in the next group as a guy that was disappointing his first year. So there's a lot working in that recent history. But what it says is you have an early first round pick and you want to take a receiver. I mean, the hit rate's very high. But when you go into the later portion of that first round, you get a very mixed outcome. You can get Justin Jefferson or Brandon Aiyuk, or you can get a guy like Traylon Burks. Even going back one year, to 2019, you have a N'Keal Harry or a Jalen Reagor there, Reagor in 2020. So you have guys in that late first where it becomes murkier, where it becomes the hit rate lessens. But if you have that early first, it's obviously a high hit rate. The Steelers, though, I think are going to be expecting themselves to pick in the 20s. I think they should be expected to be a playoff team. They should expect themselves to be a playoff team. So if you go there and you say, you're going to be picking 25, then that receiver that you would pick at 25 is probably less likely to be equal to Ayuk, which I think changes the conversation around that first round pick a little bit because the Steelers are probably going to be thinking about their first round pick as one that's going to be a late first, not an early first. If they thought they, weren't going to be super competitive this year and that was going to be a top 15 pick, I think they would be a lot less inclined to make that move just based on that hit rate, based on recent history at the wide receiver position. And then you kind of have to factor in Ayuk wanting, $30 million on top of that, probably. I mean, he's going to want a lot of money. And he's a great player. I just think, a $30 million contract plus the first round pick, it has to work for a specific position. But I also look at the Steelers, and it's hard to argue they might not be that spot. I think there's two spots where it works. One, that Ayuk is your missing piece to getting you to Super Bowl contention. I don't think he's that for the Steelers. I still think, the Steelers have a few questions they need to answer. Really, they just actually need seasoning in some spots. Those young O linemen just need to get a year older, different things like that. They really just kind of need a year. This feels like, that kind of transitional kind of year before they really hit the ground running at a high level, but they are going to expect themselves to win this year. So Ayuk definitely fills their biggest void on offense. I think the other kind of area is when you're a young offense, you don't have any obvious contracts that you're going to sign in the future, and you have a lot of future cap space. This is a young offense. It really is. You look all over the offense, it's a young offense. And there's no obvious extension candidates that are guaranteed to get anything yet. Najee Harris just has fifth year option declined. Jaylen Warren probably is an extension candidate, but he's not going to break the bank. You look at the O line, it seems like they're going to maybe let James Daniels walk. That would be a big contract, but they aren't going to talk to him this summer. So that obviously puts him on the outs more than it puts him in. I mean, and then outside of that, no one else is on that O line that's going to get a big contract. Say I'm all one contract player, I think probably. And then, Jones, Fautanu, and Frazier are far enough away to where you really don't have to worry about those guys. I think the one obviously big looming question is George Pickens. I think ideally he would be an extension candidate, but I also think, they're going to want to see the signs of growth and maturity. And they want him to repeat what he did last year. Last year was the breakout campaign on the field. Want to see him, mature a little bit off the field and carry that into obviously on the field success too, once again. If that happens, I think he is a perfect extension candidate, but I don't think in the Steelers' minds it's a guarantee right now. So, maybe the one guy you get an extension to, Fryermuth is in the last year of his deal too, so you have to think about that. But there's no obvious like massive extension can't, so you're not going to have a ton of money sunk into the offense. On defense, yes, you're going to probably pay TJ Watt pretty soon. What happens with Cam Hayward, I think, is another kind of question. About who's going to be the extension candidates over there, but they're going to have money to play with. There's no obvious quarterback that is going to, take up a ton of money. Really, there really isn't. I know they don't have an answer there, but Ayuk could come in here and make sense from that perspective because he can fill, that star spot they wanted on offense and really be kind of this, I guess, this guy, this pillar, if you will, on offense that they can really lean upon. He's the alpha dog one. Him and Pickens are a great running team, man. Like they are a great one too. And Pickens will only have 1 year left on his deal, and he'll want one next year if they pay Ayuk. I still don't think, even if Pickens has a great year, matures, I don't think signing Ayuk long term precludes them from extending George Pickens. We've seen teams do this. We've seen the Eagles do this even with a big contract in a quarterback with Jalen Hurts. They extended both Devontae Smith and AJ Brown. So I don't think it precludes the Steelers from paying George Pickens if they pay Brandon Aiyuk. I don't really think it does. And the Eagles on that perspective, they're paying Smith 25 a year and AJ Brown 32. I mean, it's not crazy, Ayuk 30 and then Pickens somewhere in that 220 range. So not crazy to use that as a kind of a stylistic comparison if that were to happen. So I think there's just a lot of different variables, and I go back and forth on it. They really do need a star. They need a receiver, but Ayuk is the steepest cost player that, when you threw around the Cortland Suttons, when you threw around the Darius Slaytons, when you threw around these other names, even DK Metcalf, you threw around those names that they had been sniffing in on. It didn't have the cost that an Ayuk had. This is probably going to be a first round pick plus the biggest contract in team history. I mean, he's going to get more than probably TJ Watt is getting. Right now, Watt's getting, I think, 28 a year. So I think Ayuk could break that. And the Steelers, that's not the way the Steelers do it. They don't do it at wide receiver very often. They don't make this to move, but Omar Khan's a little different. I think he'd probably be patient, wait to see what happens. But I really think if you want him, you're going to have to give up your first. I just look at, the teams that they're going to be up against in that contention. You look at the Raiders, the Commanders, the Patriots. I think those teams are going to be less willing to give up their first round pick. They have young quarterbacks. And so, that they have a really big chance to maybe get a high draft pick, the 49ers, if those teams are willing to offer their first. I don't see that. I think they'd offer their seconds. And I think the Steelers, when you look at that and you say, okay, our pick could be 25th overall, something like that, we can offer that and Trump, 34th, 35th overall. That's kind of the math I'm using when I'm talking about the first round pick for the Steelers specifically, just because if you were offered a second round pick by Pittsburgh and a second round pick by, say, Las Vegas, I think you would take Las Vegas. If I were the 49ers, at least I would, just because I would imagine that the Raiders are going to be a worse team this year, by my math at least. So that's kind of where I'm coming from there. So the calculus on this Ayuk stuff, man, it's tough. I understand why you make the move, but I also think that there are drawbacks with a lot of the cost. But I think ultimately, I think I'd probably do it. I just think he's the type of player that they could use. He's a perfect scheme fit. By all indications that I've gotten out of San Francisco, really model guy, comes in and out, works hard at his craft, has taken leaps every year. A great teammate, can be a leader in the future for the room. So. I think that this is a move that carries risk. Obviously, it carries a heavy burden and a heavy cost. But if I'm the Steelers personally, where I would think I would be picking late in that first round, and I'm looking at what I have invested in the future, I think they can make this Ayuk thing work. All right, folks, that's all for today's Steelers breakdown. We'll be back tomorrow. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, turn on the notification bell if you are listening to this on YouTube. If you are listening to this on a platform, make sure to give us a review, like as well. Thanks for listening, everybody.